Thick, heavy air clung to the small clearing, which was encircled by dense forest stretching for hundreds of yards. 8 people lay scattered in the grass, and nearby were torn scraps of paper bearing the same message. Find the weapon, kill the beast, earn your freedom. There was no connection to the outside world. No phones, no radios, only prison uniforms and bewildered faces. A pounding headache throbbed in some of their temples, as though from a gas or an injection administered before their arrival. One of the prisoners, a man with closely cropped hair and a pronounced Latino accent, was loudly cursing. He called himself Ramirez and demanded an explanation. Clutching the scrap of paper, he shouted profanities at the others, his gaze darting around. No one answered. Most of them had gotten to their feet, taking in the strange surroundings. Their prison uniforms hinted that they had been plucked from confinement, but where they had been taken remained a mystery. A tall man with a military bearing swept his eyes across the clearing. He raised his hand, signaling everyone to be quiet. His voice was calm and authoritative. He mentioned serving in the U.S. Army and introduced himself as Gray, seemingly intent on taking control of the situation. He pointed out that transporting a group of inmates from different prisons, gathering them in one clearing without the authorities' knowledge, was virtually impossible. The government must be behind it, he said. After a brief pause, he suggested they find a way out and keep their wits about them. A few listened to Gray in silence. A man in glasses with neatly styled hair stood a short distance away, monitoring his pulse, as if checking his own breathing. He bent over a bush, examining the leaves with clinical caution. His composed face betrayed little anxiety, but the way he inspected the area hinted at a background in medicine or research. Nearby, a pale woman with tense eyes stood frozen, saying nothing. She didn't like that someone was already presenting himself as a soldier, though she saw no reason to trust anyone's claims yet. After all, they were all convicted criminals. A strong-looking man with sharp features glanced around and spat on the ground. He was visibly seething, occasionally touching his side as if recalling a recent injection or blow. Another man, thin, pale, and jittery, kept scanning the clearing's perimeter, as if searching for a fence or a road. His gaze swept the trees as though he were reading invisible signs. The soft rustle of wind whispered through the trunks, stirring an unsettling sense of foreboding. Ramirez raged on, refusing to dance to someone else's tune. Perhaps he understood that a grim experiment was underway. The instruction, "Kill the beast to gain freedom," felt like a cruel taunt, but the words on the paper didn't look like a joke. An oppressive silence took hold when Ramirez bit his lip and glared at everyone in fury. No one rushed to share personal details. These were people with serious criminal backgrounds, yet there was no interest in revealing histories. Gray tensed as he heard a sound in the distance. Still, he believed they should stick together. The forced awakening of the prisoners on the clearing felt like the start of a deadly hunt. He recalled how prison guards' cameras typically monitored inmates' movements. From his experience, nothing about their sudden appearance here was accidental. He told the others that acting alone would likely get them killed. No one knew where the fence was or what exactly this beast might be. It could be a literal monster or something far more cunning. The silent man in glasses didn't interrupt Gray, but nodded to show he grasped the need for unity. Ramirez twisted his mouth in disgust, but stopped arguing. The big, aggressive-looking man shot Gray a hostile look, but kept quiet. The pale woman shoved her hands into her prison-issue pockets and backed away a few steps, watching everyone warily. The thin man continued studying the treetops. Then, in a hushed voice, he remarked that, beyond the thick foliage, he could see the top of a tall fence about a quarter-mile away. Moments later, the clearing erupted in a clamor. Ramirez kept cursing, others discussed a route to the fence, and questions flew about what the beast on the note could be. Gray stood off to the side watching the uncertain group form. Suddenly, a piercing roar shattered the air. Something that looked like a human with wolf-like features burst from the undergrowth. An elongated snout, powerful claws, thick fur bristling around its neck. The creature moved with superhuman speed. People panicked, darting back dozens of feet from the point of attack. Ramirez yelled, trying to grab a rock or a stick, but in a single bound the werewolf-like beast closed the distance. Its snarling roar was unnaturally loud. Ramirez fell to the ground as the creature slammed him with a clawed paw. His scream of pain tore through the clearing. Without hesitation, the beast seized him by the shoulders and dragged him into the depths of the forest. The others stood there, stunned by how swiftly it had all happened. Then came silence, broken only by the crack of branches. The pale woman pressed a hand to her ribs, staring after Ramirez, speechless. The man in glasses nodded to himself, as though mentally cataloging the monster's behavior. Gray broke out in a cold sweat, not expecting things to escalate so quickly. No one wanted to chase after Ramirez, likely certain he was already doomed. A moment later, the thin inmate with the unsteady gaze moved toward the spot where the werewolf had pulled its prey into the brush. He studied the ground, pushed branches aside, and touched the broken twigs. The others kept vigilant, scanning the perimeter. The silence was suffocating. The thin man finally stood and announced that the tracks looked like wolf prints, but their size and the way they pressed into the soil suggested the creature moved on 2 legs. He cast his gaze around the group, declaring they were dealing with something far worse than an ordinary animal, something like a werewolf. Gray took a long breath, reflecting on how horrifying and ruthless this experiment seemed. Judging by the height of the fence, the government had likely staged this test to pit the beast's animal instincts against the convict's will to survive. The man in glasses studied the snapped branches with a pensive air. He recalled how secret projects often operated. The beast might be a product of genetic experiments, or some form of biological modification performed on a human subject. Everyone was still in shock. Some might have considered sprinting away, but the tall fence and the creature's unpredictability made escape feel pointless. The pale woman bit her lip, looking around, fists slightly clenched. No weapons were in sight, and the beast appeared far stronger than any human, even one in prime shape. The large man who had looked so aggressive earlier just exhaled and turned away. Tension ran high as they waited for any sound from the woods. The thin inmate, who identified the monster as a werewolf, broke the silence by revealing a bit of his background. He spoke about his time in parks and wilderness areas, about survival skills in vast stretches of land. His words came out oddly, punctuated by mentions of how nature exacts revenge for humanity's destruction of forests and wildlife. He mentioned a rage that once consumed him upon seeing people obliterate wild habitats. He never stated his name, but the wild gleam in his eyes suggested he was more than just a man. He felt connected to the animal world. He peered into the dense undergrowth as though ready for a new challenge. Gray listened closely. It was clear the thin man probably knew how to navigate in the forest. Maybe he could guide them. A faint breeze rustled through the clearing, stirring the branches. After several minutes of tense quiet, there were no more sounds of struggle. Ramirez was gone. The chilling realization that the beast could vanish without a trace weighed on everyone's mind. Finally, Gray sighed heavily and proposed heading to the fence to assess its height and see if there was any weakness or hidden opening. Everyone murmured in agreement. No one knew if Ramirez was still alive, but they all sensed they were now part of a deadly game. The beast was real, and without a plan, their odds of survival were slim. In the distance, branches snapped. The creature was still out there somewhere. Gray signaled for everyone to form a tight circle. He reminded them that they had no chance hand-to-hand against such a predator. The self-proclaimed ranger concurred, saying it was impossible to kill the beast with bare hands. Several people nodded solemnly. The pale woman let her gaze sweep the forest where the werewolf lurked. None of them dared act alone. A man who had remained tense and silent since waking up finally spoke, hands still in the pockets of his prison uniform. He raised his head and said calmly that they would all die alone. The beast could hunt and kill any one of them with little effort, so leaving anyone behind was suicide. The strong man lowered his eyes, cursing under his breath. Remembering Ramirez's fate was the last thing he wanted. Reality suggested that sooner or later, they would face that same horror. The pale woman shifted her weight, listening to Gray, and nodded in agreement. The doctor in glasses, the one who had been examining the bushes and checking his breathing, remained unemotional, but agreed they needed a collective plan. The animal would likely strike again, so they had to arm themselves somehow. Just then, one of the inmates noticed a metal box partially buried in the grass. It looked as though it had been bolted to the ground in advance. Gray gave it a wary glance before flipping the latch and lifting the lid. Inside were knives, pistols, a rifle, and even an automatic weapon. There was also a camp hatchet with rust stains. No one understood why the weapons were so readily available, but they assumed it was part of the experiment. The prisoners grabbed everything they could. Gray checked the slide on a pistol. The pale woman snatched up a compact handgun. The man in glasses carefully set aside a knife, eyed a short-barreled revolver, but chose the automatic rifle instead. The ranger took the rifle he found, while the strong man grabbed the hatchet and grumbled that the arsenal wasn't enough. Gray agreed and said their next step was to find a place to spend the night. He suggested heading for a rise that peaked above the treetops a couple of miles away. The ranger remarked that such a vantage point would give them a better view and might offer some defense if the creature attacked. Traveling through the forest would take time, but it seemed like the best option. Moving with caution, they set out into the trees. Gray took the lead, signaling silently with his hand from time to time. The ranger scanned for any sign of movement, ears tuned to the slightest rustle. The pale woman kept her eyes on the treetops. The strong man brought up the rear, clutching the hatchet at the ready. The man in glasses stayed near the middle, contemplating how events might unfold. Glancing toward the towering fence, he wondered if it was electrified. It was clear from a distance the barrier was designed to make escape virtually impossible. They spoke only in hushed snippets. Someone mentioned Ramirez again, but the consensus was that he was likely dead. Still, no one knew if the monster might keep a victim alive for some reason. However, the evidence pointed to a creature whose strength far exceeded the norm. Most suspected it was cunning, perhaps even trained. Gray again thought about secret government labs. During his military service, he had heard rumors of programs that created new forms of weaponry. They pressed on, weaving between the trees. Realizing there was almost no chance of escape bound them together, and any squabbling over leadership had died down. Danger loomed everywhere, sharpening their sense of unity. A distant bird call echoed, but no sign of the beast emerged. Eventually, they paused to catch their breath. In a group like this, at least they stood a fighting chance if something attacked without warning. Gray repeated that they must stay together, though trust among them was practically non-existent. Aside from bare details, no one was sharing their history. It was clear some among them were extremely dangerous criminals, yet for the moment they had no other choice. They looked up at the rise, still a few hundred yards off. The path to the hill threaded between 50-foot-tall trees, where the thick canopy blocked most of the sunlight. Overgrown shrubs and drooping branches made progress slow. The ranger knelt to inspect the ground, pointing to deep prints he recognized as belonging to the beast. The size and shape confirmed it was much heavier than a normal wolf. Long claw marks scored the soil. The ranger shut his eyes for a moment, as though trying to fathom how such a being could run on two legs. Quietly, he said it only strengthened his suspicion that they were facing a genuine werewolf-like creature. Soon, a nervous man carrying a rifle came closer to the ranger. He muttered disjointed sentences about having too few bullets, then started talking about a god of weapons who demanded more bloodshed. Gray overheard, scowling. He asked the man where he got these ideas. The man confessed he had once been a sniper on classified missions. His gaze darted wildly, and his speech was becoming erratic. It was clear to Gray that the man had severe psychological issues, so he opted not to provoke him. They kept moving. Reaching a small stream, they stopped to refill water. The pale woman stood apart from the group while the man in glasses studied the bank. Suddenly, a strangled cry broke the silence. It was the woman who had spotted Ramirez's mutilated corpse nearby. His body bore gaping wounds, blood soaking the ground. The others rushed over, horrified at the sight. The doctor in glasses crouched next to the remains, examining the torn flesh. He noted the angles of the cuts, commenting that the beast had gone straight for the arteries, as if it knew exactly where a human was most vulnerable. His face remained unnervingly calm, and the faintest trace of a smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. Sarah, the pale woman's name, watched him with revulsion. She realized he understood anatomy far too well to be just a regular physician. He spoke of severed limbs as though it were some kind of gruesome fascination. The strong man spat and stepped back, muttering under his breath that the doctor was a psycho. Gray tore his eyes from the body and cursed softly. There was no doubt now that once the werewolf took hold of someone, that person was as good as dead. No question remained. The prisoners were test subjects in a cruel experiment, and the use of a werewolf as a living weapon was inhuman. Appealing to the authorities seemed futile if the government itself had orchestrated this. Once they finished examining what was left of Ramirez, the ranger noted that the beast's tracks led north. No one wanted to follow them. They knew they had almost no chance in a confrontation without a solid plan. Sarah glanced upward and noticed drones circling overhead, a wave of helplessness washing over her. Small devices buzzed about 100 feet overhead, quietly circling and clearly recording everything the prisoners did. The strong man muttered that they were all in plain sight, right under the watchful eye of the cameras. Gray suspected there would be no easy path to escape, especially with the fence that was clearly electrified and nearly impossible to get through. A few people went down to the stream, scooping water into their cupped hands. Only the faint splashing and the muffled rustle of the wind broke the silence. Dr. Hale tore his gaze away from Ramirez's corpse and remarked that this spot wasn't safe. They needed to continue toward the rise so they wouldn't be caught off guard. He glanced up at the drones, then shifted his eyes to Sarah, who was covertly watching him. He gave a slight nod, as if indicating that no one was ever truly safe. Sarah caught his look but said nothing. Gray gestured for everyone to move. A burial for Ramirez would only waste energy under these circumstances. His corpse was nothing more than evidence of the beast's brutality. The group huddled closer together, continuing along the stream toward their goal. The shock from seeing Ramirez's torn body still hung in the air. Yet their plan remained the same: reach the higher ground, fortify themselves there, and figure out how either to escape or kill the werewolf. All the while, the drones trailed them like a reminder of some unseen watcher's omnipresent gaze. After several hours of trekking deeper into the woods, they reached the base of a hill that rose roughly 40 feet above the surrounding terrain. The climb was steep enough that they had to help each other avoid sliding on the crumbling soil. By the time they settled at the top, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, and the forest was fading into twilight. From the hill, they could see part of the fence extending hundreds of yards in both directions, with no gaps or breaks in sight. They decided to make a small camp on a flat patch of ground. Nightfall, everyone recalled, might be especially dangerous. The question of a campfire arose. Troy, the sniper still muttering about gods of war, pointed out that he wouldn't be able to aim in the dark, so he needed light. The pale woman, Sarah, agreed, adding that without a fire they'd stand little chance of noticing the beast's approach. A man who introduced himself as Harry disagreed, arguing that a blazing fire would make them too easy to spot. Crusher, the strong man who had previously complained about their lack of weapons, sided with Harry, saying he was ready to fight the werewolf in the dark if he had to. He hated the idea of drawing more attention. The Thin Ranger spoke quietly, reminding them the beast likely had excellent night vision, so fire wouldn't make much difference on that front. Besides, the forest held other dangers, and a fire would at least boost their morale and offer some protection against any other creatures lurking in the shadows. The need for light prevailed. They gathered dry wood for a small fire and arranged a watch rotation around it. Harry and Crusher volunteered to take the first shift. A thin column of smoke curled into the sky as flames began to flicker. The group settled on stones and fallen branches, rubbing tired eyes. Crusher tightened his grip on the hatchet, feeling the rush of adrenaline. In a low voice, he started talking to Harry. It turned out Harry recognized him from some old fight recordings, in which Crusher had participated. Crusher smirked, saying that in bare-knuckle matches he'd been unstoppable, shattering bones and feeling a special surge of power in his fists. He reminisced about how only prison had prevented him from becoming a world champion. After hearing this, Harry admitted he had been a contract killer, a pro who took on the most dangerous jobs. He was caught by accident, but it was enough to land him behind bars. He explained he had always operated stealthily, never failing a single job until a small oversight finally tripped him up. They spoke in whispers so as not to disturb the rest of the group. Crusher spat, recalling his fights. He lingered on the thought that if he battled the werewolf he could finally see who was stronger. But abruptly he pressed his palms to his temples, frowning as though a painful memory had surfaced, some family tragedy he bore responsibility for. He fell silent, eyes clouded with distress. Midway through the night, darkness consumed the forest. The small fire illuminated only a few feet around them. The silence was unbroken, No snarls, no rustling. Those who slept did so fitfully, waking at every faint gust of wind. Harry periodically ventured a short distance from camp, checking the hill's perimeter. Each time he returned, he shook his head. No signs of movement, no prying eyes. The sniper lay with his rifle clutched tight, using a makeshift pack as a pillow. Dr. Hale stayed near the center, occasionally opening his eyes to cast around as if wanting to keep everything under surveillance. Sarah sat a bit apart, arms around her knees, leaning against a rock. She drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, flinching at the slightest sound. The ranger seemed to have dozed off, clutching his knife in a white-knuckled grip so he wouldn't lose vigilance. Suddenly, a horrifying roar split the silence. It didn't come from close by, but rather from the far side of the hill. Crusher jumped to attention, muscles tense. But no attack followed. The beast's howl faded, and the night returned to an unsettling stillness. Only the sniper muttered something about impending doom, then shifted his position. Harry and Crusher remained alert for a long time, eyeing the darkness, but the creature never appeared. By morning, no one felt rested. As the first rays lit the hilltop, the group was on its feet again. The question arose of what to do next, and who should try searching the fence for any weaknesses. Action was necessary. Sarah, already looking toward the horizon, suggested they check the perimeter for a possible flaw in the barrier. She figured killing the monster without a solid plan was nearly impossible. Perhaps they would find a gate or a vulnerable spot by the fence. Despite his exhaustion, Crusher immediately volunteered to go with her. Troy, the sniper, also wanted to join them, arguing that he needed to scout with his rifle. The others decided to remain and guard the hill. Gray evaluated the plan and agreed. Harry hefted his automatic weapon and said they should stick to a single strategy, but that he'd stay at the camp. Dr. Hale adjusted his glasses in silent assent. Sarah readied her pistol, checking the ammunition with a quiet sigh. Deep down, she held out hope that searching near the fence might yield even the slightest chance of escape. They intended to be back by sundown. So 3 people, Sarah, Troy, and Crusher, descended the slope, planning to circle through part of the woods and examine the fence up close. Gray watched them leave, brows knitted, instructing those who remained not to wander. The events of the previous night proved that the werewolf could appear at any moment. Daylight offered no guarantee of safety, and now it was clear that staying on the hill indefinitely was pointless unless they could breach the perimeter. Sarah led the way east, because the fence lay about 800 yards from the foot of the hill. She walked in front, pistol at the ready. Crusher dragged one foot, trying not to show weakness, but his breathing was labored. Sometimes he had to pause for breath. Troy trailed behind, anxiously reloading his rifle over and over, as if afraid he might miss the critical moment when the beast appeared. After about a quarter mile, they came upon a small hollow. The ground here was wetter, the vegetation denser. Sarah picked her way around big puddles, remarking that if someone planned an ambush, this would be the perfect spot. She looked around, saw only older tracks, possibly animal prints, but nothing fresh. Crusher was beside her when he suddenly asked what she'd done to end up in prison. He said he didn't recall seeing her name on general inmate rosters. Sarah paused a moment, stared at him blankly, and remembered everything that had led her to a life on the run and to murder. She kept her silence, but her thoughts replayed the grim details. The politician she'd lured in disguise, slipping poison into his champagne. The drug lord she'd poisoned while posing as a maid in his mansion. The trail of blood left by anyone who stood in her way or tried to harm her since childhood. her training, the harsh upbringing in a closed institution under cruel overseers, and the series of killings she committed when she set that place ablaze. She recalled how her hatred for people had built up over the years, how she had brutally dealt with anyone in her path. This forest and the group of criminals around her stirred memories of that training where survival went hand in hand with the absence of mercy. She gave no answer, which annoyed Crusher. He cursed her for being cold-hearted, but Sarah only quickened her pace. Troy, walking behind them, muttered something about her being like a snake that could strike at any moment. She ignored the comment, unwilling to start an argument. Another 200 yards on, they reached the massive fence. It was about 20 feet high, with heavy coils of barbed wire dangling from the top. Insulators and high-voltage cables were visible at intervals. Sarah was careful not to touch anything. Crusher lobbed a rock at the metal mesh, and sparks flickered, confirming the deadly current. Troy proposed shooting an insulator to disable the system. He took aim and fired several shots. The bullets hit the metal and stuck there, but the insulator remained intact. Clearly, the fence was built to keep no one from leaving. A weary Crusher let out a bitter snort, realizing they couldn't breach a barrier like this with makeshift methods. Suddenly, they heard branches crack behind them. Sarah spun around, but the werewolf lunged out of the undergrowth before she could fully react, slamming into Crusher's shoulder. He went down, dropping his knife. Troy, whose real name they'd learned was indeed Troy, tried to line up a shot, but the beast moved too fast. Sarah raised her pistol, but didn't get a chance to pull the trigger as the creature knocked her off her feet, and then leapt back onto Crusher. Muddy earth turned scarlet with blood as the creature roared, deafening them. Crusher, summoning his strength, swung his fist and slashed with a knife, trying to strike the beast's head. The creature jerked but didn't retreat, only roaring more ferociously. It crushed Crusher's ribs by pressing a heavy clawed paw against his chest. Troy, who had fallen to the side, finally managed to lift his rifle and fire, but he missed because the werewolf suddenly shifted position. Gathering her courage, Sarah fired several shots, aiming at the creature's upper back. It recoiled, releasing Crusher, then seemed to vanish into the foliage before they could deliver a killing blow. Crusher lay there gasping, blood streaming from his mouth and from the wound below his ribs. Sarah rushed to him, staunching the shoulder injury with a rag while Troy scanned the surroundings, terrified the monster would return. They had no choice. Crusher couldn't move on his own. Gritting their teeth, they dragged him back toward camp. The return trip took ages, and Crusher's breathing grew more ragged by the minute. Sarah urged Troy to keep going. He grumbled that the god of weapons would deal with the beast, but looked utterly shaken. By the time they reached the hill, Crusher was drifting in and out of consciousness. Dr. Hale regarded him coolly and announced there was little hope. He checked the wound, shook his head, and said the injured man might serve as bait. Hearing that, Sarah felt a surge of rage, but she held her tongue. She recalled how Hale had studied the previous victim's remains with a chilling smile. Even she found his calm detachment unnerving. Brandon, who sat by the fire, nodded in agreement with the doctor's plan, while Captain Gray grimly approved, acknowledging they had no other option. Harry, holding his automatic rifle, avoided looking at Crusher as the man writhed in pain. He also made it clear he had no objection. Troy sat off to one side, murmuring that the god of weapons would soon demand more blood. Sarah just stared at the bleeding Crusher, jaw clenched. Her hatred for the monster fused with her contempt for the doctor. She understood that they were all on the brink of death, and the werewolf would never relent. All she could do was watch as Hale methodically bandaged the wounded man, showing no real compassion. Captain Gray ordered them to position themselves around the camp to create an ambush. He laid out how to set up overlapping fields of fire without endangering each other if the beast appeared. They needed a clear line of sight and minimal obstacles. Given their limited ammunition, every shot had to count for maximum damage. Brandon, the former ranger, hammered stakes around the area where they planned to lay Crusher. He rigged simple tripwires with tin cans rattling at the slightest pull, hoping the noise would warn them of the monster's approach. He worked in silence, occasionally glancing into the forest as if searching for something. He radiated a strange composure as though curious about what might happen. Dr. Hale made no real attempt to save Crusher, only ensuring he wouldn't die too soon. Hale rinsed the wounds with water and wrapped them with scraps of cloth and makeshift tourniquets, without so much as a painkiller. Crusher lay near the fire, moaning and barely conscious. Sarah's gaze never left Hale, noticing the indifference in his every move. She saw him look at Crusher as if he were a test subject. Meanwhile, Troy and Harry checked their weapons wordlessly. Troy sat off to the side, arranging bullets and murmuring under his breath about a god of weapons who demanded sacrifices. Harry disassembled his automatic rifle, making sure it wouldn't jam. He deliberately avoided eye contact with Sarah or Brandon, fixating on his preparations instead. It was clear he despised the idea of shooting with so little ammo to spare. The campfire lit a space about 30 feet in diameter. Captain Gray indicated where each shooter should stand. Sarah would be on the right, covering the sector that faced the bushes. Harry would take a central position for direct fire. Troy, the sniper, positioned himself higher up the slope so he could fire from above. Brandon and the doctor took spots to the left, hidden behind rocks. Gray himself carried a pistol, ready to move wherever he was needed. Crusher remained the key to their trap. His blood, his groans, and his weakness would draw the werewolf, while the flames provided enough light for them to aim. Sarah kept glancing at Hale, standing next to the groaning Evans, Crusher's actual name. She remembered the doctor's grim suggestion, just give him to the beast, and felt a cold fury. This was a situation where pity had no place. Everyone's survival depended on tight coordination. Still, her contempt for Hale was palpable. He stared at Evans the way a researcher might watch a lab animal, indifferent to its suffering. Brandon allowed himself a subtle smile as he checked his tripwires. From time to time he cast sidelong glances at Harry, as though studying how the man handled pressure. Troy clicked his tongue whenever he heard movement, occasionally lifting his gaze skyward in some odd form of prayer. He kept repeating that the night was long and that the god of weapons was already waiting for the outcome. The sky began to darken. Clouds covered the moon, and visibility worsened. Captain Gray ordered them to shut off all unnecessary sources of light, leaving only the campfire so the werewolf wouldn't spot their positions. Sarah crouched near her hiding place, her heartbeat quickening. If they had set the trap correctly, the beast would be caught in a crossfire from several sides. But that required flawless coordination. A couple of missed shots, and the monster would get to them. Then there'd be no escape. Crusher drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally waking to moan softly. Dr. Hale stood not far away, his eyes shifting between Crusher's wounds and the darkness beyond the firelight. Sarah found herself imagining how the werewolf might have smelled blood even during the day. By now, based on previous encounters, the beast was likely to hunt at dusk. A chill ran through her as she pictured its clawed paw closing around the injured man's throat. Only a few minutes remained until full nightfall. Everyone had to brace themselves for a fight. There were no jokes, no laughter, not even from Brandon, who had become grimly focused after planting stakes and hanging tin cans. Hale adjusted Crusher's bandages and stepped back, deliberately leaving the wounds in a state that wouldn't heal on their own. Harry edged closer to the bushes to get a better line of sight. Captain Gray checked his pistol one last time and signaled for everyone to stay silent. They settled in to wait, listening to the wounded man's strained breathing and tensing at every noise. Sometimes the wind rustled the bushes, causing all of them to tighten their grips, anticipating a sudden lunge from the beast. The campfire crackled, throwing dancing shadows on the ground. Somewhere higher up, Troy lay motionless with his rifle, quietly humming to himself now and then. Sarah clenched her pistol, fully aware the werewolf could appear at any moment. Gray caught her eye briefly, conveying that all they could do was wait. Night dropped over the hill, and the forest's hush grew almost metallic in its intensity. The improvised alarm cans quivered lightly in the breeze, but there was no indication yet of an approaching threat. Nearly an hour passed before a faint clatter came from the direction of the bushes. Troy tensed and lifted his rifle, trying to make out a shape in the darkness. A dark silhouette emerged from the undergrowth, breathing heavily and staying low to the ground. It was hard to make out details, but the powerful torso, elongated limbs, and wolf-like features left no doubt. This was no human. The beast edged nearer to the fire, warily skirting a couple of stakes as though sensing a trap. Suddenly, Crusher let out a tortured groan and tried to push himself upright, as if wanting to show he wasn't entirely helpless. The werewolf stiffened, pausing to stare at the wounded man. Troy couldn't hold back. He pulled the trigger but misjudged the distance and angle. The bullet whistled just over the monster's shoulder. With a furious snarl, the creature sprang sideways. Gray cursed under his breath in the darkness, knowing they were supposed to let the beast come closer first. But things were moving too fast. Harry acted more decisively, firing a short burst from his automatic. Several rounds struck the werewolf, and dark droplets of blood spattered the ground. The monster didn't flee. Whirling toward its attackers, it let out an enraged roar. The firelight caught its eyes, revealing raw malice. Its taut muscles rippled, and dark fur glistened in the glow of the flames. It lunged forward, using the bushes for cover, zigzagging between tree trunks. Harry and Sarah fired, splintering branches with bullets, but the creature pressed steadily closer. Crusher, realizing the werewolf was upon him, tried to raise his knife. But the beast slammed into him with crushing force, seizing him in its claws. A sickening snap sounded as bone gave way. Crusher didn't even have time to cry out. He collapsed onto his side, blood streaming from his mouth. A single stifled moan escaped before it was cut off by a ragged gasp. The werewolf straightened over the lifeless figure, as if displaying its dominance. Sarah fired her pistol, squeezing off a string of shots aimed at the upper torso. Her rounds landed, and the beast staggered. Dr. Hale, still maintaining his eerie calm, contributed 2 more shots from his own weapon. One ricocheted off a rock, the other lodged in the werewolf's thigh. The monster let out a spine-chilling howl but didn't go down. Its eyes burned with an even fiercer rage. Troy tried once more to line up a precise shot, but the werewolf moved too quickly. It sprang between the bushes, swinging an arm to bury its claws in the sniper's neck and collarbone. Troy fell back, dropping his rifle as the beast roared. In that instant it became clear the plan was unraveling and the monster was prevailing. Brandon, hidden under cover, seemed on the verge of firing but hesitated. On his face was a strange awe as he watched the werewolf tearing into his fellow inmates. He waited until Harry paused to reload, then aimed his weapon at Harry's back. But Sarah noticed the movement. She turned, fired, and hit Brandon in the side. He cried out, unable to complete his shot at Harry, but still squeezed the trigger. A bullet caught Sarah along her flank, knocking her down. She clutched her bleeding wound. Hale took advantage of the chaos and rushed at the werewolf with a knife, hoping for a lethal strike while it was focused on Troy. But the beast, half crazed by pain and fury, whipped around instantly. With one savage thrust of its claws, it tore into Hale's ribcage. The doctor managed a short gasp, his eyes widening in something like morbid curiosity at how the monster was destroying his body. A heartbeat later, he went limp, toppling to the ground. Harry saw there was no saving Hale. He fired at the werewolf, attempting to drag it away from the doctor, but realized his ammunition was nearly gone. The beast, now close enough that Harry could smell the reek of its blood, looked more terrifying than ever. Sarah, semi-conscious, could no longer hold her pistol. Brandon writhed in pain near a bush, clutching his side. The entire clash was a disaster. The werewolf flung Hale's body aside and snarled. Harry darted between rocks, desperate for a vantage point to take a final shot. Captain Gray, waiting in the darkness, hoped to catch the creature in a clear line of sight. But the monster dashed behind the bushes where Troy's body lay, and the sounds of struggle went silent. Night pressed in around the camp, where Evans, Crusher, Troy, and Hale lay dead, and Sarah was badly wounded. Harry realized the beast was lurking close by, ready to pounce again. Brandon moaned, clutching his side while the smell of gunpowder and blood hung thick in the air. Gray tried to estimate how many rounds remained, but he knew saving the situation was probably too late. They'd banked on a swift kill, only to find the werewolf was much tougher than expected, and Brandon's betrayal had shattered any unified defense. The monster hadn't left. It was merely biding its time for another savage strike. The dying fire cast flickering light on the bodies, offering no real hope of rescue. Sarah's breathing was labored, sweat beading on her pale face. Harry bit his lip, glancing at her, but he couldn't rush to help. At any second, the beast might ambush him. Brandon whimpered curses under his breath, hand trembling on his shotgun's trigger. Gray seemed to be holding his breath, mentally weighing how to escape this death trap. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, lighting the bloodied scene in a feeble glow. Spotting that the werewolf had slipped out of immediate view, Harry realized they had one tiny chance to reload and mount a last stand. He grabbed a spare magazine and slammed it into his rifle. Sarah, lying on her side, stared at her wound. Blood kept oozing, and pain locked her body in place. Brandon hissed in agony, eyes glittering with fear and fury. Gray peeked out from behind a rock, scanning the murky perimeter. He had only a few bullets left in his pistol. He noticed a shadow among the trees, possibly the beast. Harry swallowed hard and took a few steps forward, signaling to Gray that he was willing to draw the monster's attention. Suddenly, the werewolf charged from only a few feet away, bursting through a narrow gap in the bushes and leaping straight for Harry. His short burst of automatic fire missed as the beast sidestepped, burying its claws in Harry's chest and slamming him to the ground. He tried to lift his weapon but never made it to the trigger. Blood poured from his torn chest. His legs jerked in a final spasm, the rifle clattering uselessly to the dirt. Captain Gray seized that split second to fire 3 shots in quick succession. The werewolf took a hit in its side and another in the lower neck, but it didn't collapse. Roaring in agony, it released Harry, whirled on Gray, and Gray squeezed off a fourth round into the monster's shoulder. The creature staggered, choking out ragged breaths, blood streaming through matted fur. For a moment it seemed close to collapsing. Gray dared hope the beast was finally dying. Sarah, half delirious, tried to prop herself up, clutching her wound and gasping for air. She watched as the battered, enraged beast lunged for Gray in one last burst of strength. They fell to the ground together, and blood pooled in the darkness. The captain tried to push the creature away, but it sank its jaws into his collarbone and crushed his chest, snapping bones. A choking gurgle rose from Gray's throat. Then he went still. The werewolf stood unsteadily, its breath ragged, body covered in shredded wounds and dripping blood from multiple bullet holes. It seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether to continue the fight. Sarah lay nearby, motionless, her hand pressed against her side, her vision fading. The beast passed by without finishing her off, apparently sensing she was no longer a threat. It moved toward the bushes, limping away. Sarah thought she might survive, but waves of weakness rolled over her as the bleeding refused to stop. Everything around her blurred, her arms going numb with cold. The last thing she saw was the creature's silhouette disappearing into the trees and a drone hovering overhead, recording every move. Suddenly the werewolf lifted its head, unleashed a menacing snarl, then leapt and smashed the drone's camera, tearing through the metal casing. Sarah exhaled, choking, then went still. Her eyes closed forever. For a heartbeat, the creature paused, gulping for air as though listening to distant sounds. It seemed to know the night's slaughter was done. Its muscles quivered with pain, but it remained alive. In the next moment, it vanished into the thick forest. The campfire continued to smolder, illuminating the fallen inmates with no hope left. Silence settled over the scene, broken only by the faint creaking of snapped branches and a light rustle of wind. No one stirred. Harry lay dead, Gray no longer breathing. Brandon, wounded at the side, had ceased moving. Evans, Hale, and Troy were scattered lifeless around the clearing. Sarah showed no sign of life. Through ragged clouds, the moon emerged weakly, casting pale light on the carnage below. Suddenly, Captain Gray, who appeared gone, coughed, though his eyes remained half closed. He couldn't stand. A broken rib had punctured a lung, and severe blood loss had sapped his strength. His hands shook as he groped for his holster, but the pistol had slipped a few feet away, out of reach. He heard the beat of his own heart, felt the warm flood of blood soaking his prison uniform. Then the whir of helicopter rotors ripped through the stillness. Gray turned his gaze skyward, seeing a large black helicopter descending, its searchlights sweeping across the clearing. The grass bent in the wind, branches whipping under the force. Before long, figures in black uniforms rappelled from the side hatch. They moved quickly, operating with machine-like precision. One carried a special whistle that emitted a piercing ultrasonic tone echoing across the area. From the edge of the forest, the werewolf emerged, staggering from its wounds but not showing aggression toward these newcomers. It approached them, compelled by the whistle's high-frequency sound. On command, the team deployed a reinforced cage with steel bars and thick locks. The werewolf offered no resistance, succumbing to the whistle's signal as they guided it inside and secured every latch. Gray, mouth partly open, wanted to curse them, trying to grasp why they had orchestrated this horrific experiment. But his voice escaped in a ragged whisper. One of the agents turned, saw that Gray was still alive, and quietly called out to the others. A man with a sidearm came over, took in Gray's mangled body with an impassive stare, then calmly raised his weapon and aimed at Gray's chest. Summoning his last flicker of strength, Gray spat out a muted profanity, rage and despair choking in his throat. The gunshot shattered the night, cutting short his agony. Blood pooled beneath him as his head lolled to the side. The helicopter began lifting the cage, attaching it to cables. The agents stowed their equipment, leaving the inmates' corpses scattered around in disarray. The roar of the engines drowned out everything else as the aircraft rose into the sky, carrying off the wounded beast and discarding all moral questions. The clearing lay still and forsaken without a single survivor. Far below, in an underground command center lined with monitors and diagrams, a group of scientists and military officers watched the live feed. The screens no longer showed a sharp image. One of the drones had been destroyed by the beast. The lead curator, seated at a long table, stood halfway up and ran a hand over his chin. He declared that the experiment was a success. The subject had demonstrated a high level of combat efficiency. All 8 inmates, each either on death row or serving life sentences, had been eliminated. The curator's assistant flipped through reports, confirming that all necessary data had been gathered. The remaining cameras had captured the key stages of the battle. Now they could analyze tactics, the fence's resilience, the subject's reaction to gunfire, and various scenarios involving an armed group. That same assistant mentioned it was time to prepare the next test, referring to another secret prison, a massive stone pit teeming with inmates. It had twisting corridors, dead ends, and caves, along with its own harsh environment. Plans were underway to release multiple creatures there to observe how they hunted as a pack. The curator listened, made a note on his electronic tablet, and ordered that a new team be assembled for further analysis. He wanted to explore ways to increase the werewolves' regenerative speed or enhance their clawed limbs if it would improve their lethality. The military personnel standing nearby nodded, well aware that this project served the country's clandestine interests. The criminals, already condemned and written off, made for perfect targets, since no one would bother looking for them. Once all details were settled, the command center staff dispersed to their respective stations. The lead curator cast one last glance at the screen, where fragments of footage showed the helicopter rising above the forest with the battered beast locked in the cage. With a flick of a switch, he powered down the monitor, remarking that the objectives for the day had been fulfilled. Only a final check was needed to ensure there were no surviving witnesses. The assistant confirmed that an agent had already taken care of the lone survivor.